So the Vietnam War remains one of the pretty much the most controversial war in Australian society, yet it's rarely talked about what Australia's involvement in Vietnam was sort of like. Even in Australia, and it's also known a lot online of that Americans ignore Australian involvement in it. So I think I'd like to touch on that today. So, involvement began with a small commitment of military advisors in 1962 with the government of then Prime Minister Robert Menzies claiming that this was to prevent the spread of communism, even though we would later find out that South Vietnamese president at the time, Ngo Dinh Diem, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, actually did not want that. Although he'd be assassinated next year by the Americans and replaced with a military government, but that's a story for another time. Anyway, so the opposition to the war at the start was very limited because it was seen as a fight against communism for the capitalist society and democracy and all that, and they were concerned it would spread in Southeast Asia after North Vietnam and the fact that it's China and all that. But it wasn't always like this. See, in 1964, the government passed the National Service Act, which pretty much makes conscription compulsory for 20-year-old males. But this was done by a rather peculiar method. It was They pretty much televised a lottery and they joined based on like the date of birth. So like if anyone who's male and over 20 years of age, if like picked up January the 20th, that means that every man who's 20th and who's 20 will have to serve in that for 2 years full service plus I think an additional 3 years for, yeah, I kind of got, but I think I'll look it up. 3 years on the active reserve list, although the full-time service will be reduced to 18 months in October of 1971. Now, this was controversial as, given that it was compulsory, that meant that conscientious objectors, which are pretty much people who do not want to serve your country based on conscription laws, whether it be for like moral, religious reasons, they would often be arrested in countries with conscription. I think that kind of thing is still quite common in Israel and Singapore. Also, how they were presented was pretty much as they're not patriots, they're cowards, they're not serving their country, or maybe even that they were communists. So this kind of caused a bit of a problem with people who decided, no, I'm not going to fight for my country in this war. As well as that, it was it was one of the first. It was pretty much the first war that was ever like televised on television, meaning that you could actually see the fighting live. And given the atrocities of it, not really taking any sides here, there was atrocities on both sides, but given that kind of made opposition to the war skyrocket because of how bloody it was, how gruesome. And so the opposition to the war grew larger and larger, as well as the fact that many were seeing this as more like just America's war and shouldn't involve Australia at all. So opposition was growing, and the government tried to curb this with propaganda and trying to like say that it was still to fight communism, but the Labour Party, which was in opposition at the time because Menzies was in the Liberal Party, although they initially supported the Vietnam War, they were starting to look more towards getting out of the war and more sympathetic towards North Vietnam, if that makes sense. So, Gough Whitlam, who would later become Prime Minister in 1972, had promised in campaigns that if he were elected, he would withdraw all Australians from Vietnam. And so, in 1972, he was elected and he started withdrawing troops. And at the peak, there was around 61,000 military personnel who served in the war, with 521 killed and more than 3,000 being wounded. And while they did leave, and by the 11th of January 1973, Australian hostilities in the country had ceased, there were some that were deployed in the country until the 1st of July of that year, and there were some Australian forces that were deployed briefly in April of 1975 during the fall of Saigon, which we all know was a massive blow to the South Vietnamese, as it's now Communist Vietnam today. And a lot of the soldiers that came home, I remember reading this in a book by Blair Harden, which is Well Done, Those Men. But they often had post-traumatic stress disorder and were often treated very poorly by basically anyone. They were viewed as like murderers and all that, and granted, it's probably not nice to, but of course, it is good to know that they were actually forced to do it, so they may have not really wanted to do it, but they had to because it was law. But they didn't really get much treatment for their post-traumatic stress disorder, and they were kind of used to it a bit. However, in the 90s, there soon started to be a bit more recognition, and after Blair Harden's book was published, he received some apologies from the anti-war activists, who pretty much viewed him as like killers beforehand. Overall, this would have been Australia's longest war, between 1962 and 1972, and if it weren't for the fact that their troops were committed in Afghanistan since 2001 to basically now, it was also the largest force contribution to a foreign conflict since World War II. So, the war had a bit of an impact on Australian society, as it sort of like taught them about the horrors of war and all that, and pretty much made Australia a bit more anti-conscription, if that makes sense, as less people are serving in Afghanistan than they did in Vietnam. So it's a pity that this is not really talked about much in schools or anything like that, because I really do think this does serve a large part of Australian history.